Show don't tell is perhaps one of the most used, or perhaps overused, expressions that are used to talk about how to be successful at writing, whether that's a book or a film script. The reason it's so used is because quite often it is correct and accurate. And it's important because it allows readers and audiences to connect more fully with the characters that they're watching and the story that's unfolding. So on today's video, I want to go over exactly what show don't tell means and a few tips on how you can achieve it in your book. So first, what does show don't tell mean? Well, let's break down those two components, tell and show. When we tell something, we're just being completely blunt and direct with our description of something that's happening. The reason that this isn't as good is because it leaves no room for the imagination of the reader. They don't have to do any work to imagine what this situation is, and it doesn't leave any room for interpretation. Showing, on the other hand, is less concerned with giving a direct description of what is happening, and more concerned with demonstrating the effects or the character's actions that then project that feeling. This is better because it invests the reader more into the situation that's unfolding. For example, if I tell you to be happy, the effect is unlikely to change your mood and just make you happy. However, if I show you various images of things that conjure up the idea of happiness in your mind, you're much more likely to have a reaction to that and therefore be more invested in the feeling of happiness. The key is to do with senses and emotions, and this is twofold. We want to limit our use of any sensory verbs and instead describe the sensation the character is feeling. We can do this by showing the physical reaction they have to something or the effect the action is having on their world. Instead of saying, "I felt cold," we can say, "There was a chill in the air," and let the reader decide whether that is cold or not. This invests your reader in the process of creating their own image in their head and interpreting the story for themselves. Secondly, when we're describing scenes, we want to avoid emotional descriptions, such as happy or sad. Because in truth, humans are far more emotive than that, and somebody's body language or reaction should show the reader how the character feels without us needing to spell it out. Instead of saying, "he was happy," we can tell the reader, "he let out a little grin." This allows the reader to interpret the character's feelings in the same way they would in real life, and thus builds a more realistic character. A further point is to demonstrate any skills, attributes, or traits that a character has, instead of just telling the audience that they exist. Don't tell your reader that a character is rich, but rather show their house and their luxuries and how they live a rich person's lifestyle. This allows the reader to fully believe the traits that this character is portraying, because again, this reflects real life. Very few people openly share directly what their skills and attributes are. Instead, they demonstrate them through their actions and behaviors, and we can do the same in writing. The final point here, and why this is so important, is trust. Lots of writers fall into the trap of telling rather than showing because they feel that they need to explain everything to the audience. You don't. Trust your audience to be smart enough to understand what's going on, and not only will this make your writing stronger and more nuanced, but it will create a more rewarding experience for your reader too. This also requires less work from you in having to do long, lengthy descriptions of every single detail. Leave some things up to interpretation, and this will create a more enjoyable experience. So, instead of me ironically telling you what show don't tell means, let's look at an example that will demonstrate how this can be effective. So for context, in this clip that I'm about to show you, our antagonist, Dieter Hellstrom, has just realized that his companions are actually spies due to a gesture that they did that was out of place. Let's start by watching the clip by itself and then look at two different ways we could describe it using telling and showing.
3 Gläser.
So that's a great scene, filled with lots of information even though there's no dialogue involved. If we were to tell this scene to somebody, it might look something like this.
3 Gläser.
Dieter looked at the 3 raised fingers. He understood that it was strange and thought about what to do next. He smiled as the waiter brought the drinks and then looked at Bridget. He watched the drinks being poured and took a deep breath. So that accurately describes what was happening in that scene, but we can feel that there's not a lot of emotional connectivity, and as the audience it might not be particularly entertaining to have that scene described in that way. So let's look at how we could show this scene instead.
3 Gläser.
The 3 fingers caught Dieter's eye immediately. He stared for a moment, weighing the information, before a whisper of a smile crept from his lips and he glanced down at the table. The smile grew wider as the whiskey arrived, before his focus lingered on Bridget. As the waiter poured their drinks, his heart was racing. He took a long, drawn breath and knew what he had to do next. Hopefully this example makes it clear why showing is always superior to telling. But we also need to note that we're using more sophisticated vocabulary. We're not using any of the sensory verbs. We're not telling the reader what exactly Dieter is thinking. What we're doing is allowing his character to express those emotions and leaving it up to the audience to interpret. And even though there's no dialogue, everybody who watched the clip without any description still understands what's going on. So that's clear that we're giving a lot of trust to our audience. Just like show don't tell, less is more is another rule that we can use for writing to produce better and more professional prose. So to begin with, let's explore what we mean by less is more and why it's so important. When we use the expression less is more, we're referring to many different aspects of writing. This could be as simple as reducing the number of words within your writing, or making your descriptions less complicated. Really, how you do this also depends on your writing style, how much information you want to give to the reader, and what kind of tone you're hoping to strike in your book. So there's lots of different things and lots of different elements that we can reduce to mean less, and let's explore why it's so important. The simple explanation is that writing less means that your book will be more reader-friendly. And at the end of the day, making your reader happy should be your primary focus as an author. Writing less maintains the pace of your book, and it helps your audience understand what's going on, and ultimately, it saves them time. Wasting words also wastes the reader's time, and this is something we need to be really conscious of. Reader enjoyment is impacted by many things, such as the size of the text and the vocabulary being used. Think about a wall of writing containing lots of academic words and whether this is something that you're going to be naturally drawn towards. In fact, most readers prefer to see short, broken up paragraphs that use succinct, relevant, and clear vocabulary to get the point across, and they usually find this the most enjoyable. More than that, it says something about you as a writer. Mark Twain once said, "I didn't have time to write a short letter, so I wrote a long one instead." Which is to mean that it's easier to write a long, rambling text than a short, concise prose, because you don't need to edit or think about what you're writing. However, if you want to show respect to your reader, then you should show them that every single word has had thought behind it. Finally, this technique is good for you too. As you practice this technique more, it will save you time both in the writing and in the editing further down the line. By being able to write in relevant, succinct, and short ways, it will allow you to avoid getting into the trap of writing long, exasperating pieces of text that need to be heavily edited later. So, let's look at 8 different techniques that you can employ to make sure that you're following the rule of less is more. First, and most obviously, is using less words. This tightens your writing and makes sure that you're focusing on the relevant and core points of your text. Stephen King once said, "The road to hell is paved with adverbs," And this is pretty sound writing advice for making your writing concise. Especially when it comes to adverbs such as very or really, it is better to find more suitable adjectives that incorporate their effect than use adverbs. For example, instead of saying, "he was a very large man," we can say, "he is huge." This paints a more interesting picture for our reader and cuts out the fluff that doesn't add anything to the passage. The information is the same, but more reader-friendly. To give another adverb example, instead of saying, "she ran quickly to the car," we can say, "she sprinted to the car." Once again, cutting the adverb and replacing the adjective with something more precise gives more information with fewer words. All of this connects and engages your reader to the story by using relevant and precise words that don't waste their time. This goes for adverbs that don't add anything extra, such as whispering quietly or shouting loudly. Whisper and shout already imply qualities of volume and don't need adverbs to make that clear. Secondly, it's important to use a wide variety of words. Not only does this stop your writing from becoming boring, but it also removes the temptation of wanting to write longer passages to explain things in detail. Using alternative words with the same meaning is essential to keeping your reader engaged and your prose fresh. You can keep the number of words the same, but vary which ones you use. Use a thesaurus to discover new words that share the same meaning. For example, "he is huge" can be "he is gigantic," or "massive," or "enormous." Same number of words, but still interesting for our reader. Thirdly, make sure that when you're writing, you're trying to use shorter sentences. Not only is this easier for your reader to engage with, but it also forces you to be more creative in the way that you express things. Let's look at some examples. Longer sentences tend to lose the attention span of the reader quickly and don't allow them to process all the information within them correctly, often leading to the reader forgetting key information. Short sentences are easier to read and focus on. They help the reader remember information. Very much the same information in those two sentences, but the second sentence is far more effective. This links with using fewer words too, so it's important to do both in order to achieve the effect. Fourth, you need to understand the point of the passage that you're writing and why it's involved in the story at all. More than that, you need to make sure that you get to the point quickly as well. This keeps your reader interested, and if something isn't relevant to the story, it can be reduced or cut out entirely. Once you've established the point, you need to get there quickly, so you don't end up writing something about nothing or boring your reader. The trick to this is to start with the conclusion. This does two things. It hooks the reader, as they will want to know how or why the situation was arrived at, and secondly, it provides context for them to use as writing unfolds. Here's an example. "I killed him because he stole my favourite sandwich." "He stole my favourite sandwich, so I killed him." Both of these sentences express the same actions and use the same number of words, but the first is more gripping and a better example of less is more, because it gets to the point quickly and doesn't waste anybody's time. Of course, the second sentence has function, but really our focus should probably be on the murder rather than the thievery. Unless you want your reader to think otherwise, the first sentence is better. Fifth, it's really important that we're using simple and clear language that doesn't require our reader to use a dictionary. This could mean that you take one big word and break it down into two smaller ones. As long as this makes the experience more enjoyable for the reader, that should be our main focus, not trying to use the most sophisticated or advanced vocabulary. There's a reason people don't use academic papers as their casual reading material, and that's because the language is not suitable for pleasure reading. Unless your audience is academic, you want to make sure that you're keeping your language simple and clear. It goes back to our video on Chapter 1. Don't get caught up in your own amazing vocabulary, as this often puts off your reader and makes you seem snobby. For example, "The car drove slowly down the road" is a simple and clear sentence. But "the automobile chugged lethargically along the asphalt-covered carriageway" is sure to turn off many readers. Sixth is about writing dialogue, and for most of your writing you should only be using the verbs say and ask when describing how someone's speaking. In fact, in lots of cases, you can even cut them all together if it's clear who's speaking. This connects to our last point about using simple and clear language. But also, when you do use a special speech verb, such as shout or whisper, it makes its impact more noticeable. After all, in real life, we say things most of the time. For example, "Really?" he questioned suspiciously. "Yes," she opined confidently. "I see," he mused thoughtfully. "I'm glad," she chirped. Instead, it's better to do this. "Really?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I see. I'm glad." This is much cleaner and easier for your reader to understand. It also makes the dialogue faster, which also reflects how we speak in real life. Seven is about using punctuation to make your writing clear and concise. Now, this can be tricky, especially with relatively rare pieces of punctuation such as semicolons, but it's a great way to shorten the amount of words that you're using and deliver information efficiently. So, for example, I could say, "I went to Vietnam last year, went to France and Germany 2 years ago, and went to Thailand and Brazil this year." But instead, using semicolons, I could say, "I went to Vietnam last year, France and Germany 2 years ago, and Thailand and Brazil this year." Using punctuation to your advantage can help reduce word usage and convey large amounts of information quickly to your audience. Finally, editing is a crucial part of this process. It might be easier, as Twain said, to write a long letter, as this means that you don't need to worry about everything that you're writing and can just stay focused on the core ideas. But once something is written, we must edit, and edit ruthlessly. You can go back and employ all of these rules into the work that you've written and try and find ways to make it shorter and more succinct for your reader. Editing is such a crucial part for creating an enjoyable experience for your audience, and it's very important that you are strict with yourself when you do this. So, I wanted to come back to these two rules, because in my research between the videos, I found a couple of extra tips that I think are really useful, and I want to share them with you. Let's explore. An important tip for less is more is to not show nothing. Now, that can sound a little bit confusing, so let's look at an example from Lee Child's The Killing Floor. "My name is Jack Reacher," I said. "No middle name, no address." He wrote it down. "Not much to write." I told him my date of birth. "Okay, Mr. Reacher," Finley said. This is a good example of how to employ this technique, but to make it clear, let's rewrite it showing nothing. "My name is Jack Reacher," I said, still sitting in my chair. "No middle name, no address." He wrote it down with a pen. "Not much to write." I told him my date of birth. "Okay, Mr. Reacher," Finley said, still sitting in his chair. Perhaps you can see what I've done here. I've added information about what the characters are doing, notably sitting in their respective chairs, as well as using a pen to write. This is an example of showing nothing. Essentially, what this means is that you shouldn't write about things that don't matter, have no consequence, or aren't significant. Yes, it adds detail about the scene, but as a reader, we've assumed that both characters were sat down. It was part of the nothing of this scene, because it's easily assumed. Just like we don't say, "She said with her mouth," or "He laughed with a smile." We can only talk using our mouths and can't laugh without smiling. Both of these are examples of showing nothing. The best way to prevent this is to ask yourself, does the reader really need to know this? If the answer is no, cut it. The second tip is all about not including unnecessary speech. Let's look at an example. So also from the same passage is a great example of this. If Jack Reacher had said, "He wrote it down, not much to write. I told him my date of birth was January 2nd, 1988. It's completely unnecessary to include this information. It adds nothing to the story and distracts the reader from the important dialogue. Keeping things short and to the point is better for the reader. We should acknowledge the power of silence when writing. I'm sure we've all heard the expression, "silence is louder than words," but this can be a little bit difficult to demonstrate in writing. Essentially, you can say something by saying nothing. Silence, or the absence of something, builds tension and intrigue. The difficulty is that this needs to be seen as deliberate from the author, rather than the reader thinking that something is missing or forgotten about. Here's a clip from the Reacher TV show that demonstrates the power of silence.
I'm sorry, I'm not good at math.
Don't take a 40% tip.
I messed up, okay?
How am I supposed to get ahead when you're wasting my goddamn money? Get your ass in the van. The hell you want, asshole? I'm talking to you, stupid.
Oh, tell me, baby, why did you stay last night? Oh, don't you hear
Listen, man, I'm just having a bad day. Won't happen again.
The final point is when it's appropriate to tell something to the reader. As we saw in the show don't tell video, most of the time it's better to use showing rather than telling. If you haven't watched that video, please go and watch it. But sometimes there's unavoidable situations where we need to tell something to the reader, and the best time to do that is using dialogue. As we saw in our example, Jack Reacher tells his name to Finley. As a writer, this is unavoidable, because even showing his passport would still require telling the reader what is written on it. So using dialogue is a natural way that information is told and can be shared with the reader. We need to be careful about turning dialogue into exposition dumps, but that comes with practice. The point is, telling is sometimes necessary to share information, and using dialogue is the best vehicle. In 1889, Russian playwright Anton Chekhov sent a famous letter to his friend, which said, "One must never place a loaded rifle on the stage if it isn't going to go off. It's wrong to make promises you don't mean to keep." From there, the concept of Chekhov's gun was born, and has influenced writers ever since. Of course, there are lots of writers who agree and disagree with the principle that Chekhov was setting up here. So today, let's explore exactly what it is, what it means, how you can use it in your writing. First of all, if it wasn't clear already, Chekhov opposed introducing elements to the story that didn't add anything to the narrative, or simply teased some higher drama that was never introduced or paid off. As Chekhov says himself, we want to avoid making promises to the reader that we can't or don't deliver, as this will negatively affect their enjoyment and make them less satisfied with the conclusion of the story if an element they were paying close attention to is simply forgotten or ignored. Determining what is a gun and what isn't is very much down to the writer. As a writer, you determine how much significance is given to an object in the way you write about it, although some objects carry inherent symbolism. For example, the wine being drunk at dinner in the story can be explained away in a single sentence and forgotten, and therefore not be important. Or it can be experienced in detail, and therefore have more weight placed upon it. Defining which is the responsibility of the writer, as you're the one who knows the story, the direction it's going in, and what needs to be communicated to the reader. This very much goes back to our less is more and show don't tell videos, where you need to decide how much detail is for colour and how much confuses or saturates the scene. That's why balance is important. The more reader's time you spend with something, the more expectation there will be that it has a function later in the story. You can highlight character skills, objects that will play a role later, or actions undertaking to make the story more interesting and set up satisfying endings. It also adds to the readability of your work, as when readers go back, they can identify the guns and watch for them being employed. As I've mentioned, some things have significance as part of their being and context. Things such as weapons, supernatural elements, or unusual character traits. These all come with attention due to their uncommon or powerful nature. So as a writer, no matter how little you write about them, they will be remembered. For example, in A Song of Ice and Fire, attention is given to the fact that Oberyn Martell is an expert in poison. As a reader, we expect that skill to be utilised at some point in the narrative. That detail is unique and uncommon, so it draws the reader's attention. And this is exactly Chekhov's point. Things that are out of place or uncommon shouldn't be included and take away the reader's attention unless they're going to have an influence on the narrative later. It's distracting. It takes away from the other things that are important in the script. We should also remember that different pairings carry certain assumptions too. The context, location, and actor all play a part in how significant something is. Guns at a gun exhibition, or carried by a member of the armed forces, will not make readers sit up and take note, but a gun in a hotel room, or carried by an old lady, might. This is where you can get really creative with Chekhov's gun too, because it can also be used to make seemingly ordinary objects exceptional by placing extra emphasis upon them. When writing about a meal, a butter knife would usually not be mentioned, and just assumed as part of the setting. But if a character, especially one in distress, were to note a knife, then we as the reader would expect it to be utilized later in the story. By placing focus on seemingly normal objects, we can elevate their weight and completely subvert audience expectations, creating surprising and shocking twists in the story. Again, this is all about a writer selecting where to place weight. Highlighting all normal objects doesn't have this effect. It's about balance. Chekhov's gun is a great rule to keep in the back of your head as a writer. Chekhov was really against introducing unnecessary objects into a scene that can take attention away from where the focus should be, creating unsatisfactory experiences for the audiences. Of course, there are other artists, such as Ernest Hemingway, who believe that you should add lots of detail to your scene to make it seem more realistic, and at the end of the day, it's all about balance. But keeping Chekhov's gun in your mind is a great way to remember to focus on the important details, to make sure that you don't overindulge and get distracted by things that don't really matter and that might make your reader unsatisfied. It's not an airtight rule. You don't have to use it for everything, and lots of critics would argue that following it 100% will make your work quite colourless, so don't do that. But just remember, as Chekhov said, don't make false promises to your audience. Don't set up threads and ideas that aren't going to be paid off or satisfied in the end, because ultimately that will affect the enjoyment that your reader has with your story. Occam's razor is often associated with other writing rules such as less is more and Chekhov's gun, but can trace its roots back much further. William of Ockham is often credited with its creation and its refinement, but it has roots that go all the way back to the time of Aristotle. Unfortunately, unlike other rules, there isn't a set definition of it, so this is a basic summary. When approaching a problem, the solution that makes the fewest assumptions is generally the best. This rule has been used in lots of different fields throughout history, most notably science and theology. But today I want to talk to you about how you can apply Occam's razor to your writing to make it simpler and more efficient. The first great lesson is about simplifying when planning. Even if you're planning a complex narrative or conspiracy within your book, you should always leave the door open for the reader to figure it out by themselves if they're determined enough. As such, you should use Occam's razor to make sure your hints and stories aren't so complicated that it takes away from reader enjoyment. If you produce the same narrative in a simpler form, then that should be your preferred choice, rather than one that's overcomplicated or overly convoluted that simply confuses your reader. Using Occam's razor in this way makes sure that your story is still enjoyable, it's still complex, but allows a certain challenge and accessibility for your reader. Secondly, we can combine Occam's razor with Chekhov's gun when deciding on details for our story. When choosing plot-critical information, objects, or characters, you can use both of these rules to keep your story streamlined and focused. It can help you establish a balance between making a rich, complex story and one that is overindulging in convoluted plot elements. It forces you to think about whether each element of the plot is necessary or just filler that makes it seem deceptively more complex. By combining Occam's razor with Chekhov's gun, you can make sure that your story stays focused and streamlined, and therefore creating the most enjoyable experience for your casual reader. Thirdly, Occam's razor is a great tool for editing. When you're going back over your work, using this rule to remove unnecessary fluff is a great exercise that you can entertain. Because you have the completed story, all the essential plot points, and a clear understanding of your characters, it can be really helpful to identify what needs to be cut. When using Occam's razor to make sure that you're using the smallest amount of assumptions possible, It can be really useful to find elements that don't have a compelling reason to remain within the story. If it doesn't contribute to the conclusions or twists of the plot, then it can be worth cutting or at least thinking about trimming down. Fourthly, and related to the previous points, is about how you write descriptions. If you follow Occam's razor, you should focus on making your descriptions, explanations, and exposition as simple as possible. This can push you to be more creative in how you show something, make you think more about the most efficient way to explain something to your audience, and make sure you're focusing on the key information that should be known rather than assumed. This makes sure that your reader stays engaged with the story and has all the information that is necessary for them to follow the plot. Fifth and finally, Occam's razor is, by nature, great for approaching a problem. If you've written yourself into a corner, or part of your narrative has kind of run its course or become stale, using this approach is a great way to get out of that. By identifying which assumptions you're making, and how this is making your story more convoluted or complex, or forcing you into a particular situation in your narrative, you can understand which areas need to be scaled back or where things need to be added in order to make it more simple and more enjoyable for your reader. So, Occam's razor is a great tool that you can use for problem solving and for making your writing more streamlined and accessible to your reader. Just keep it in the back of your mind when you're writing or when you're going back through your editing, and you'll be surprised how often you can find little things that can just be cut that remove a lot of the assumptions that your reader needs to make in order to enjoy the story. The term MacGuffin is widely credited to Alfred Hitchcock. So, who better to explain what that is than the man himself in his interview with Dick Cavett in the 1960s?
MacGuffin you see in most films about spies. It is the thing that the spies are after. In the days of Rudyard Kipling, it would be the plans of the fort on the Khyber Pass. It would be the plans of an airplane engine and the plans of an atom bomb, anything you like. It's always called the thing that the characters on the screen worry about, but the audience don't care. And someone asked, what is a MacGuffin? And it's described in a scene in an English train going to Scotland, and one man says to the other opposite him, he said, what's that package above your head there? And the other man said, oh, that's a MacGuffin. He said, well, what is a MacGuffin? He said, well, it's an apparatus for trapping lions in the Scottish Highlands. The man said, but there are no lions in the Scottish Highlands. He said, then that's no MacGuffin.
So, in a story, the MacGuffin is that object or information that our characters are pursuing. Think R2-D2 in Star Wars, the box from Seven, the briefcase from Pulp Fiction, the One Ring in The Lord of the Rings, or the Ark of the Covenant in Raiders of the Lost Ark. These are often great ways to push your characters into action, to give them a tangible objective that is easy for the reader or the audience to understand, but also to elevate the stakes within the story. As he alluded to in that interview, Hitchcock essentially believed that the object in question is meaningless to the audience or the reader of a story, but incredibly important to the characters within that story who are trying to pursue it. Think the mole in Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, or the Infinity Gauntlet for Thanos, or the Horcruxes for Harry. These are all technically invented terms that don't really have any real meaning for us as a reader, but the character's pursuit of them is what sucks us into the story. We can certainly see the power of this motif in lots of popular works of media. There are many stories which are focused on that struggle between the antagonist and the protagonist trying to get a hold of a certain object, maybe to control it or destroy it for some higher purpose. There are lots of great examples all the way through literary fiction, such as the Prime Radiant from Asimov's Foundation series, or the Maltese Falcon from Horowitz's book of the same name. All of these are great examples of where that MacGuffin has played a key role in the story. Hitchcock isn't the only person who supported the idea of having a MacGuffin, but others have taken it a little bit further. Speaking to Vanity Fair in 2002, filmmaker George Lucas argued that the MacGuffin should not only be important for the characters within the story, but we should try and invest the audience or the reader into thinking that it's important too, and caring about the achievement, destruction, or possession of that object. And there's a really good argument here. Think about how much we as an audience care about the contents of the briefcase in Pulp Fiction or the box in Seven. This really sucks us into the story and has us asking questions long after that experience is finished as to what might be within that MacGuffin. So now that we've established exactly what a MacGuffin is and what its purpose can be within the story, let's look at a few different ways that you can write a MacGuffin in and how you can use it to make your story more compelling and more interesting for your reader. First of all, let's look at what we should be careful about when introducing a MacGuffin. It's really important that a MacGuffin isn't some contrivance from the author to solve a problem that they didn't have a creative solution for. If it feels too convenient or coincidental, or lucky, then a reader will feel cheated, as there was no setup for it or for its function. Think about the dagger in The Rise of Skywalker, which had no setup and worked far too conveniently to be believable. We should also be careful and remember a MacGuffin is not the story. It is simply something that pushes your characters and the story forward. Your story and narrative is about the characters, how they grow and change in pursuit of the MacGuffin. Raiders of the Lost Ark is not about the Ark. It's about Indy's journey to protect it or destroy it. Lord of the Rings isn't about the ring. It's about the Fellowship's adventure to destroy it and Sauron's attempt to reacquire it. That is what makes a story compelling and interesting to your reader. A MacGuffin is a great motivation, but if the story's not fleshed out around it, and the characters are shallow, it doesn't matter how amazing or compelling the object is. So, let's talk about what we should do. When writing a MacGuffin into your book, you should make sure to define what it is, what it does, and the stakes are depending on who possesses or destroys it. In the future, we will talk about stakes in further detail, but for now, just know that your reader needs to be informed why this object is important early in the story and what the consequences could be in certain hands. In Skyfall, the hard drive with agent names on it is introduced immediately.
Is it there?
Hard drive's gone.
And we're told in the first 5 minutes what the consequences will be if Bond doesn't recover it. Having that gets us on board with the journey immediately and helps us understand the gravity of the situation. That's also why defining what it is so important. If your object is magical or supernatural, you need to set out the rules early and stick to them. This avoids you being contrived later on in the story. It also allows you to move the focus onto your characters quickly and start their development around this object. For example, the ring within the Lord of the Rings, its powers are established early, in that it can produce invisibility, we understand why Sauron wants it and what powers it will grant him, and we also understand the negative effects of the corruption that the ring has when we see Bilbo leaving the Shire. This is all established early, and it doesn't change later on in the story. On that point, we should also note that a MacGuffin can be anything. It doesn't have to be an object. So this can also include people or animals, such as the Soviet mole in Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. Having your MacGuffin as a person is also a really great way to make sure that your story is really character driven, because you're not focused on all the detail of an object, you're focused on a character, their motivation, and why it's so important that people acquire it. Think about the girl with the dragon tattoo as well. Another great example of a person who acts as the MacGuffin. Whatever you decide to do, just remember that the MacGuffin is not the focus of your story. It can be the focus of a character's motivation, but your story should always be about characters, how they're growing and how they're developing in their pursuit of the MacGuffin. So just make sure that when you're writing your MacGuffin into the story, that you're staying focused on the characters, not the objects.
People can, of course, find allegories if they wish to, but as you can see, it was wholly outside his conception of what he was doing in what he called fantasy. The world he created exists for itself and for what it tells you and for what delight it gives you. It may, of course, contain, as indeed it does, elements of his own comprehension, his view of the world at large, but not anything out of the primary world. Just as it contains no specific reference to the Christian religion, it actually contains no specific reference to communism or fascism. Absolutely not. His view of such things, if available at all, will be in solution in the secondary mythical or mythological world that he has created, but not actually itself. Therefore, it is in no sense an allegory. The double meaning is not present.
It might come as no surprise to you by now, but I'm a huge fan of J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of The Lord of the Rings, and I really admire his writing style and approach to creating a story. In the clip we just watched, his son Christopher discusses his father's dislike for allegory, and I wanted to explore this a little bit more to help you write a more effective and long-lasting book that will be interesting for generations to come. Let's get started. First of all, what is allegory exactly? Simply, an allegory is a second explicit meaning behind a text. This is where your story makes direct comparisons between any fantastical element it contains and that of the real world. Typically, these are usually moral lessons, such as the Christian message in C.S. Lewis's Narnia series, or the political message in Animal Farm by George Orwell. So, what's the problem with allegory? Well, this all feeds back to one of the most important rules in writing: show, don't tell. Your story should aim to be broad and accepting of different views, so that anybody can pick it up and apply whatever message they perceive to be there. You want to avoid telling your reader how to feel. All of this is best demonstrated, not by being explained by me, but by the man himself.
As for any inner meanings or message, it has in the intention for the author none. It is neither allegorical nor topical. I cordially dislike allegory in all its manifestations, and always have done so since I grew old and wary enough to detect its presence. I much prefer history, true or feigned, with its varied applicability to the thought and experience of readers. I think that many confuse applicability with allegory, but the one resides in the freedom of the reader, and the other in the purposed domination of the author.
This is to mean that, according to Tolkien, focusing on applicability allows the reader to have the freedom to imagine what the story is about and what lessons can be garnered from it. They are then free to apply that to their own life without the intervention of the author. Allegory, on the other hand, Tolkien says, is more about the author dominating the reader by promoting explicit messages. All of this isn't to say that allegory is a bad thing necessarily. Indeed, some of the most successful works ever produced contain memorable allegories that help us understand complicated themes or ideas, such as Plato's Cave, Newton's Apple, or the Bible. Allegory has a strong range of utility. However, we should also recognize that these are primarily used to help people understand concepts such as democracy, existence, or gravity. Or they are used to promote a point of view held by the author. This can be massively entertaining and intriguing if you share that point of view, such as Lewis's Christian faith or Orwell's anti-totalitarian stance. But there is a risk of manipulation and abuse there if done by the wrong people. Examples should be obvious. One of the principal risks of engaging in allegory for storytelling and making them a core component of your story is that when you focus on so much on the message or secondary meaning, the characters or story you're trying to tell tend to suffer as they become shoehorned into supporting the secondary narrative rather than the one they're actually involved in. This can make characters feel hollow, contrived, and unnatural. In the end, the best writers are able to do a bit of both, or at least recognize that they cannot completely separate their own thoughts and ideas from their works that they're creating. The most successful works in history have applicable but not explicit allegories that allow them to be interpreted, debated, and enjoyed by people of any background and in any time period, because they are able to apply their own meaning to it without being wrong. When you pin an allegorical meaning to a work and make it an integral part of the enjoyment, you risk alienating your audience if they disagree or view it differently. Maybe you have a message you want to communicate, or you don't care if everybody likes your message. There's no problem there. Tolkien wanted to promote ideas of hope, and his Catholic upbringing clearly had an influence.
But importantly, he never told his readers what his books meant or how they should see them, and he went to great pains to avoid any obvious parallels being drawn. Ultimately, beating people over the head with unashamedly explicit ideas and telling them that this is the correct view has a tendency to make people resist that notion because people simply don't like being told what to do and think. The more strongly you impose your allegory, the more you're fighting the human desire to think freely.
So, I want to emphasize one more time that allegory isn't necessarily bad, and it can almost be unavoidable to include things from the real world in the story that you're trying to create. However, what I really admire about Tolkien's work is how long-lived it is and how admired it is by different generations across different time periods. And I think a huge part of this is credit to Tolkien for trying to avoid allegory.
Cliffhangers have been used in multiple sources of media, including film, TV, and literature. If you don't know already, a cliffhanger is where we end a scene, chapter, episode, film, or book with a suspense or moment that is designed to leave the audience wanting more. Imagine, as the name suggests, a character hanging from the edge of a cliff by one hand, then the scene ending there. Did they fall? Did they pull themselves up? We need to continue investing into the story to find out. This technique is usually used to create tension and anticipation, forcing the audience to wait until the next installment or section to find out what happens next. The obvious intention of this is that it makes your reader continue to the next chapter, your moviegoer come back for the sequel, or your TV show watcher to binge an entire season. Cliffhangers have been around for a very long time, but today let's look at how you can use them effectively when writing your own story, how you can avoid potential contrivances, and help you spot cliffhangers in media that you support. When placing cliffhangers into your story, the most important part is that the situation needs to have a certain level of ambiguity to it. If the outcome is obvious to the reader, or the perilous side isn't likely, then the cliffhanger won't be effective. Fake-out deaths are classic examples of how this can go wrong. This is especially prominent in TV and films where time is limited, so deaths are a quick way to get emotional payoff from the audience. The issue here is that writers may want to have their cake and eat it. They want the emotional effect without losing a character. These are bad cliffhangers, because more often than not, the feint is obvious to the audience. In the Lord of the Rings films, we are teased that Aragorn might have died, but I have never met anybody over 12 who thought that this was an actual possibility or something that actually happened. The outcome wasn't ambiguous. Instead, this felt like a form of emotional manipulation to make us invest more in the story, and it showed. In The Italian Job, however, the good original one that is, the entire film ends with the bus literally hanging over the cliff, with our characters and the gold trapped perilously inside. This is a tantalizing example of an expert cliffhanger, where the outcome is far from obvious given everything we've seen in the film. Despite no payoff, this scene solidified the film as a classic, with debates about what happened next until the writers revealed it later. This again speaks to the ambiguity necessary to create convincing cliffhangers. In The Italian Job, we don't know what will happen next, and we have no good indication that will tell us. In The Lord of the Rings, however, we are all fairly certain that Aragorn hasn't died, considering he's going to be the main focus of the rest of the film and the third. Another important step to any effective and satisfying cliffhanger is to build anticipation before the moment. You want to steadily invest your audience in the proceedings, hinting at or stating the outcomes that could come to pass if something should happen. More than that, cliffhangers have to serve the plot. They are not for emotional manipulation. They should contribute to the narrative, and then provide a natural climax of events, then cut to black. All that build-up and anticipation is what makes a cliffhanger so effective. You're denying the audience the satisfaction right at the moment they expect it. The film The Thing has a great cliffhanger ending with the dog running across the ice. We've spent an entire movie building up the stakes of what will happen if the dog escapes, so the cut to black after the gunshot without knowing what happens is the perfect amount of payoff. Similarly, as seen most in TV shows and books, you can use the knowable length of the medium to build anticipation, only to give some payoff at the end. When you're watching a TV show, you know how much longer is left, how many more episodes there are to go. Each minute we watch in the final or penultimate episode builds the tension of what can be squeezed into the time and what will be less mysterious for now. In Season 1 of Game of Thrones, Ned Stark is dead, and we are waiting for the North's reaction. The entire last episode builds and builds until Robb is finally declared King of the North at the end. This is enough information to hook us and make us invest in the second season, but not so much information that we're not interested in finding out more. We want our audiences to have questions, and some information. We don't want to tell them everything, as there'll be no intrigue, and we want to avoid telling them nothing, otherwise it's too abrupt and forced and there's no reason for them to come back. When it comes to cliffhangers, we also want to make sure we don't use too many. This is the same for almost any writing technique, but let's just focus on cliffhangers. Overuse creates emotional fatigue in our audience, and essentially makes them stop caring about what's happening. It cheapens them, and can shatter the immersion for the audience. On top of that, you need to make sure any payoff you give is satisfying. Do this by being strict about the logical consistencies in your story, as well as making sure you're not being contrived in how you do things. Planning can be really useful here, to make sure you keep track of all the details that allow a payoff to make sense. Darth Vader's reveal as Luke's father is a great cliffhanger for the next Star Wars film. We are given the entire next film to build up for the payoff after the cliffhanger, which leads to it being immensely satisfying. You need to let your cliffhanger breathe after you've done it, and then build up the audience investment to pay it off. You can't rush these things. Leave space for resolutions to ferment naturally. Chewbacca's fake-out death in The Rise of Skywalker is revealed to be fake within a few minutes of the cliffhanger being done. This doesn't give us time to come to terms with the consequences of what's just happened, or what the consequences might be in the future. It feels cheap and manipulative. There is a balancing act here, though. The more investment, the stronger the payoff needs to be. And you do need to pay off cliffhangers that take place in the middle of your story. Cliffhangers to finish are fine. It creates a talking point. But baiting your audience in the middle and then giving nothing, just like with mystery boxes, will leave them deeply dissatisfied. I mentioned it earlier, but a final point that is worth exploring is making sure cliffhangers feed into your story. You don't want to be creating cliffhangers at the detriment of character development or cohesive narratives. Don't prioritize shock value over character growth. For example, if a character's story arc is cut off abruptly in a cliffhanger, without any resolution or further development, it can feel unsatisfying and undermine the audience investment in that character and the rest of the story. The best cliffhangers support characters and provide some shock. Make the cliffhanger related to the character's development and arc. In Breaking Bad, Jesse is kidnapped by a rival drug gang, and his fate is left uncertain. But it also helps us understand his character more, as he's forced to confront the consequences of his actions and grows as a consequence. More than that, cliffhangers are great for raising stakes rather than stopping stories abruptly. In Gone Girl, the narrative shift between the characters allows for tension to build as Nick discovers more clues that may help his case. Not everything is told to us, but we can feel the stakes rise with each cliffhanger. So, cliffhangers can be a very effective tool in your writing arsenal, but just make sure you're using them wisely, despite how tempting it can be to try and get some quick shock value. Remember that the best cliffhangers aren't the ones that shock us. They're the ones that drive the story and the characters forward, and thus invest us emotionally in the narrative. The term red herring has been around since 1807, when English polemicist William Cobbett used it to refer to the custom of English hunters using a strong-smelling smoked fish to divert and distract dogs from chasing undesirable animals such as rabbits. For literary purposes, a red herring serves the same purpose as the smoked fish, with our reader being the dog, without being derogatory, that is. In a story, the red herring is a device used to divert the reader away from the main plot or focus of the story by introducing a false lead or piece of information. The utility of this is to add to the depth of your narrative and allow, at least partially, the real story to be obscured, making its reveal later in the narrative more surprising. We keep our reader on their toes by not allowing them to be entirely sure if they can trust the information they're being told, and challenging them to follow a more intricate story. As a writer, this is important as it keeps your reader engaged, creates tension, provides surprise and twists, as well as heightening the overall sense of suspense. As you can imagine, red herrings are far more common in mystery-style novels where finding the truth is the whole point. Look at any Agatha Christie book or watch Alfred Hitchcock's films to get a great idea of how you've been deceived by the writer. Just like with when we subvert expectations, the larger umbrella category of which also includes red herrings, we have to be careful in the way we carry this out. Let's be clear, do not misdirect your reader simply to pad out your story, like in the Da Vinci Code, nor should you do it to manipulate emotions of the audience with things like fake-out deaths in Star Wars. When you use them to simply add more content, it is obviously lazy and convoluted. Don't treat your reader like an idiot. If you have something you want to say or show, and the only way you can make it happen is to misdirect them, then you're probably doing something wrong. Go back and find a way to more naturally work that element into the story if it's so important to you. The red herring has to serve the plot. Having a character falsely accuse another character in a detective novel almost always leads to the detective finding additional information that helps them solve the case as a result of the diversion. It is important to the plot, not to the padding. A book I've praised before, Gone Girl, makes excessive use of red herrings, and has been criticised by some for relying too heavily on them, and that the final reveal felt overly contrived because there were so many red herrings that they felt like they were just there to pad out the runtime rather than add to the story. You should also not use red herrings to manipulate your audience emotionally. Simply pretending that terrible things have happened, only to reveal that they didn't actually, is dishonest writing. Cake and eating, etc. As we have said, red herrings need to advance the plot, as with any literary device. They are there to enhance the story. You don't need to use them to have a twist or a surprise, so you don't need to use them for trivial emotional shocks either. The Sixth Sense and The Usual Suspects employ red herrings explicitly to serve their plot, with very little wastage and very little intention to manipulate their audience. This leads to their payoffs being satisfying and earned. So, how can we actually write red herrings into our story without them feeling forced? Well, many of the points that are important have already been mentioned. Make sure your misdirections are used strategically, integrated seamlessly within the story rather than being tacked on haphazardly as a contrived subversion. Consider how the use of misdirection may complicate the story or challenge readers' assumptions. You'll need to be objective here, and not give your story more or less credit than it actually deserves. Consider whether it actually needs the twist, or you're just writing a boring story and trying to spice it up. That doesn't mean you can't use them to make a slower story more interesting. Of course you can. Just make sure that they are grounded in the logic and reality that you've established. Ensure that they make sense in the context that they're being used. I'll refer back to The Usual Suspects here again, where the red herrings of different suspects are exactly what we'd expect in the context of a police investigation, and are logically consistent throughout the story. As for writing these in practically, it's your responsibility to have the red herrings foreshadowed throughout the story, but not be too subtle or too obvious. Have the innocently arrested suspect plead their innocence in a way that makes the reader not believe them. They're being told the truth, and therefore the truth is being foreshadowed, but the other characters in the story may be influencing the reader's interpretation of that fact. Or perhaps the suspect confesses guilt as a twist, even if we aren't sure that they did it. Tyrion from A Song of Ice and Fire is a great example of these elements, with both a false imprisonment and a false confession that serve to move us further away from who actually killed the king.
I did not kill Joffrey, but I wish that I had.
Tyrion's alleged crime is foreshadowed throughout the series in the words that he says and the actions that he does, and this leads the reader to believe that he may have actually committed it.
I will hurt you for this. A day will come when you think you're safe and happy, and your joy will turn to ashes in your mouth.
The huge point here, though, is about establishing strong and fleshed out characters, with distinct personalities and motivations that can provide fertile ground for red herrings. By creating a range of plausible suspects, you can keep your audience guessing and deepen their engagement. That's part of the secret of the longevity of classics from Sherlock Holmes and Poirot, as they have a whole host of characters in each story with compelling motivations to commit the murder. When you read them again, and you see the clues yourself, and therefore are able to dismiss the red herrings, this all leads to the final result and makes sense. So, before you set about misdirecting your audience, just keep these things in mind, and make sure that the red herrings are integrated into the narrative of your story with interesting characters, as well as resisting the urge to saturate your story with the stink of fish to hide the cake.
We've all heard the terms trope and cliché used to describe certain elements within a film. They are usually used negatively and interchangeably, but is there a difference? Well, the answer is yes, hence this video. So today I want to explore a little bit more about what the difference is between a cliché and a trope, and how you can use these to make your story better, and what you need to avoid doing that will make your story worse. Clichés are elements, expressions, ideas, or actions that happen in very similar ways across stories and mediums. They are predictable, they lack originality, and often institute a state of boredom in your audience because of how overly familiar your readership is going to be with what happens when one of these is employed. For example, expressions such as "love conquers all" or
"I have a bad feeling about this"
are so common and simplistic that they lack depth and nuance. They express tired concepts in repetitive ways without introducing anything fresh. Plot devices such as "the chosen one" or prophecies often fall into this trap as a contrivance for the writer to move the story or to give importance to a character without too much effort. Or actions such as the damsel in distress or the brooding action star with a troubled past. On the surface, they may not automatically be bad, and I am going to explore how you can use them a little bit later on. But first, let's look at their counterpart, the trope, and what that is before we explore how we can use both of these more effectively in our own writing. Tropes are narrative devices, motifs, and storytelling commonalities that serve as recognizable patterns within particular genres or styles of story. Tropes are used to engage an audience's expectations, to introduce an element of the familiar that can help the audience understand where they are in the story and what sort of dynamics they can expect. Obviously, if these are overused, they can become clichés quite quickly, and that's a distinction we need to start drawing now. For example, the buddy cop trope is very common in investigative or action stories where two characters from different backgrounds are forced to work together. The forbidden lovers is another trope used in romantic settings. For storytelling, tropes can take the form of things such as the hero's journey for compelling someone to go on an adventure, or the fish out of water story for somebody stepping into a new world. We also get tropes for characters, such as the mentor or the tragic hero. These may seem like normal writing conventions, but there are a few things we need to be careful about to avoid our tropes turning into clichés. You may already be noticing the difference between the two, but let's use a few examples to illustrate the contrast and make it crystal clear. A character saying, "run away with me," to the star-crossed lovers is a cliché. Two lovers being star-crossed is a trope. A man losing his family and turning to drinking is cliché. A man losing his family and resorting to get revenge is a trope. The villain giving a monologue about their plan is a cliché, but the villain undergoing a redemption arc is not. So simply, the core difference between these is that clichés are isolated, individual actions or words. One situation, one phrase, one event that is set in the way that it's performed and done the same way in almost every iteration. It plays out, continues, and ends in the same way each time. A trope, on the other hand, is a convention of storytelling, and familiar, but it is flexible in how it's applied. It covers more ground and more time in the story to be realized, and is not isolated to one action or expression. That doesn't mean that tropes can't become clichés. They definitely can. The redemption arc of a villain can be cliched if they ask for forgiveness on their deathbed, because it becomes an isolated action rather than a process or a condition they've been exploring across their story. The point is that tropes allow for a great deal of flexibility. The hero's journey can be modified and presented in 1,000 different ways. The underdog story can play out in a whole variety of manifestations, and the exploration of forbidden love can take more forms than we can imagine. Clichés don't do this. They cannot do this. They are stationary and one-dimensional. They are easy cards to play from writers who don't know how to use tropes originally. But cliches do have a useful purpose and shouldn't be dismissed out of hand. By nature, being predictable and boring allows writers to more cleverly subvert the expectations of their reader by setting a situation up to be cliched only to produce something surprising. Elsa in Frozen is seen as empowering because rather than being a damsel in distress and hiding away in a tower, she subverts the cliché and essentially rescues herself. Leslie Knope in Parks and Recs is caught in a love triangle, but rather than creating a situation of spurned lovers, the show emphasized the emergence of respectful, meaningful, and mature friendships. A good exercise for any writer is to identify the clichés in their story and then experiment with subverting them. It won't always work, but it doesn't mean that clichés are useless. The opposite action should be taken for tropes. Feel free to use tropes, but don't rely on them. Some originality on your part needs to be injected into your application of the tropes, otherwise they simply become clichés. A mentor is a well-established trope, with an immense amount of value to a story, but having a wise old master who speaks softly but is secretly a badass isn't going to make your work seem very realistic. Indeed, that's quite cliched. Nor is having the trainee dominate the master and having them humbly bow down to their pupil in awe and reverence and realize how much they need to learn. No, that's also a cliché. Lionel Logue in The King's Speech is a great example of a mentor done differently, between two proud adult men who respect one another as equals despite their differences. Or how about the aggressive, pressure-filled mentor relationship between Miranda Priestley and Andy Sachs in The Devil Wears Prada? These are both the same trope of having a mentor, but they demonstrate how widely applicable that trope can be, and how we don't need to fall into the wise old master cliché. The final point here is that these standards change. Things that were once clichés fall out of fashion and can become original again. Tropes that seem standard can become repetitive in their execution if everybody does it. You need to stay vigilant with the originality you're employing. Are you doing something really different, or just something that's not as common? It's an important distinction that could be the difference between determining how well your work ages. So the writing rule here is to put effort into your originality. Clichés rear their ugly head when we become too lazy or complacent to put in the requisite amount of effort to create something that's truly original and unique, instead falling back on tired patterns that have been used thousands of times in other media and other stories. Don't be that person. Take time to subvert your audience's expectations away from clichés and put effort into making sure your tropes don't become clichés in return.
In No Time to Die, James Bond faces a dilemma at the end of the film. The chemical weapons are sealed in a World War II era bunker, and the arms dealers are on their way to collect them. The Royal Navy has launched a missile strike to destroy the base, but the blast doors have been closed by our villain. Bond is faced with a ticking clock. Open the doors so that the missiles strike, destroying the weapons once and for all before the arms dealers can carry them away for all sorts of inevitably nefarious ends. But there's one problem here. The ticking clock, those incoming missiles, is completely fictitious. And it makes all the tension of what should be an epic climax to Daniel Craig's time in the role feel very hollow and pointless. The ticking clock is a very common motif in storytelling. Writers use it to create tension and urgency within a story. Do X before Y or Z will happen. It's a fantastically simple and easy to employ formula for ramping up the stakes in your story and can be applied across multiple genres. Can Ross get to the plane before Rachel leaves? Can Harry destroy all the Horcruxes before Voldemort's plan comes to fruition? Can Shrek reach Fiona before the potion wears off? Will they get everybody off the bus before it runs out of fuel? Will the ships fall for Joker's plan and destroy the other before their time limit expires? Endless numbers of films, books and plays employ a ticking clock to ramp up the story and the pace within. What the ticking clock allows you to do is to set a limit. Don't let the name fool you though, because it doesn't even have to be an actual timer. It could be any deadline that once passed has irreversible consequences, and we want to see if our protagonist will make it in time. What they allow you to do is establish clear stakes that define what is at risk and what actions are needed. This gives our narrative much more focus and helps invest our reader more fully into the story. It makes the pages turn faster as we're desperate to see if the protagonist will succeed or not. More than that, they give people motivation to do things. If the Germans weren't looking for the Ark of the Covenant, then Indiana might not even bother to search for it himself.
And right now, apparently, there's some kind of German archaeological dig going on in the desert outside of Cairo.
Now, we've got some information here, but we can't make anything out of it, and maybe you can. Tanis development proceeding. Acquire headpiece, staff of Ra.
If Sauron weren't actively moving against the Free Peoples, then the Council of Elrond could have spent another 6 months talking about their plan. Ticking clocks are great devices for pushing things to happen, for kickstarting a quest or getting a character underway.
4 people are sitting around a table, talking about baseball, whatever you like. 5 minutes of it, very dull. Suddenly, a bomb goes off, blows the people to smithereens. What do the audience have? 10 seconds of shock. Now take the same scene and tell the audience there is a bomb under that table and will go off in 5 minutes. Well, the whole emotion of the audience is totally different because you've given them that information. That in 5 minutes' time, that bomb will go off. Now the conversation about baseball becomes very vital because they're saying to you, don't be ridiculous, stop talking about baseball, there's a bomb under there. You've got the audience working. Now the only difference is, although I've been guilty of, in the picture sabotage, of making this error, but I've never made it since, the bomb must never go off. Because if you do, you work that audience into a state, and then they'll get angry because you haven't provided them with any relief. And that's almost a must. So a foot touches the bomb, somebody looks down and says, my God, a bomb, out of the window, then it goes off, just in time.
But how do we implement them well? How do we make sure that they don't come across as contrived or forced? Let's come back to Bond for this. First and foremost, the clock needs to be realistic. The reader needs to believe that this could feasibly happen, and that the actions undertaken by the character are the only possible choices in that scenario, as well as being in line with our character's personality. At the end of No Time to Die, our clock is established. Missiles are coming, doors need opening, arms dealers are on the way, and Bond needs to open the doors before the missiles arrives, or the bad guys win. Except, that's not really true. We're told that the missiles will bounce off the doors if he fails, but these are cruise missiles from the 21st century warship against World War II era bunker doors, so that probably won't happen. We're told the arms dealers are coming, but given no reason why the warship can't destroy them instead and call off the missile strike so Bond can take all the time he wants to open them from a second strike. It's common knowledge that warships carry more than a handful of missiles, and we're only shown a couple of boats heading to the island. Why couldn't the ship just destroy them and buy Bond more time? You might point out that Bond is infected, so him leaving the island isn't all that important and he'll want to die anyway. But this seems horribly out of character for a man we know to be full of resilience, perseverance and self-control. Are we really meant to believe that he'll have no choice but to throw himself on Mandolin and Mathilde when he knows full well that it'll kill them? Probably not. The problem we run into here is that the ticking clock is completely fabricated and contrived by the writer, not by the characters or the story we've seen. The writers want there to be a clock that forces Bond to sacrifice himself, that creates urgency and tension at the end. But the issue is that it's just not realistic. in line with the character or natural to everything we've seen in a film that was pretty good and consistent up to the final third, where story beats were forced into place. The second point here also applies to Bond, is that the ticking clock needs to be integrated into the story naturally. Great ways to do this would be a race against another character to achieve the same end. Competition is a very natural thing that motivates and pushes people forward. Having opposing factions, like in Indiana Jones, chase the same object is a great way to establish urgency and pace. It has the bonus effect of being very compelling for character development, as we see what lengths a person will go to in order to beat the clock. In James Bond, everybody's on the same side. The warship, Bond, Mathilde, MI6, and everybody except the arms dealers want the same resolution. They don't want Bond to die. Instead, the ticking clock forces this to happen when the solution is right in front of us. Alternatively, we can have characters race against the force of nature, such as the asteroid in Armageddon, but it should go without saying that you do need to do research on this point to make sure the race and the solutions are realistic. So perhaps Armageddon isn't the best example here. So something like The Revenant, where Hugo Glass is pushing against time before nature kills him, and before his former hunting mate, who left him for dead, is well beyond reach. Realistic and integrated into the story, as it should be. Similarly, the conclusion of the clock can't be too convenient or rushed. Establish rules and constraints early in the story that will prevent characters from choosing quick ways out, as well as necessitating the sacrifices or hard decisions to solve it. Make use of foreshadowing, and ensure that your character is the one to solve the problem, in line with their personality and skills. Again, James Bond is shown to be resourceful, resilient, and full of creative, quick-witted solutions. This is shown in the very same movie, so suddenly it smacks of inconsistency when his brain suddenly stops to work right at the end, when we're pretty sure, as we've seen before, that he could have found solutions to the problems he's in. Don't just magic up abilities either that haven't been established or reinforced, such as Teddy's miraculous abilities to fly planes with no training just to solve an immediate writing problem, like what happened in The Dial of Destiny. The solutions to problems aren't always going to be neat and tidy either. Sometimes they will demand a cost or have unexpected outcomes, like Marty McFly altering his family's financial situation by accident. Or maybe the solution requires collaboration with unsavoury bedfellows, like Katniss Everdeen forming an alliance with Peter. These elements add complexity and originality to your ticking clock. It's harder to write because you have to think more about the threads you're creating, but it's also far more entertaining and rewarding for your reader when you do it right. This is something that the writers of No Time to Die forgot to do. Their solution is all too neat and tidy. It would have been far better if Bond had survived the missile strikes and then had to deal with the issue of not being able to touch the woman and the child that he loves. Far more compelling, far more entertaining. And so here comes another point that's worth mentioning, that you do need to be careful about being too cliché with your use of the clock. Everybody these days expects the, "I didn't make it. Oh wait, yes I did," trope that is so often applied to the ticking clock, like we see in Friends, where Ross thinks he's lost his only love, only to find out that he did actually beat the clock. It's okay for a cheap pull on the heartstrings, but it's very predictable. Instead, something like Philomena employs the clock in a subtler way, in that we're not sure if the titular character and Martin will uncover everything before the trail goes too cold about her son. When the timer runs out, the twist is compelling and sets up the second half of the story. I won't spoil it for you as the film is excellent and worth watching, but it allows us to see the consequences of the clock play out in unexpected ways. We should try to subvert the expectations around the use of time limits, so that our reader can't automatically predict what will happen the moment the clock is introduced. Again, Bond disarms the laser within 7 seconds to spare in previous films, but Frank Drebin trips over the wire and unplugs the bomb by accident. One is predictable, the other is amusing in how it foils the clock. Try to be unpredictable and make the story more interesting for your reader. So, when we use a ticking clock, it becomes a heartbeat of our story, a pulse of urgency and a focus for our character that is so incredibly important to get right. Make it realistic, with understandable stakes, and maybe even a twist or two thrown in for good measure. Think about Ethan Hunt clinging to the side of the train trying to stop it in time, or Luke firing his torpedo moments before devastation, or Sarah Connor fighting to prevent the end of the world before it becomes inevitable. You need to infuse your clock with purpose. Ensure it resonates with the core beliefs and struggles of your characters, and let it amplify their desperation while making the reader believe the consequences are very real. Don't let the clock be arbitrary and contrived to artificially create tension like in Batman vs Superman. Invest energy into creating the tension that naturally fits with the story like in Aliens. Don't cloud your climax with nonsensical action and cliché twists like in Transformers, but instead make it meaningful and memorable like the destruction of the ring. If you do all this, then your clock will enhance the story, rather than waste all the potential just for superficial tension. In An American Werewolf in London, there is a fantastic scene where the eponymous creature stalks a man in the underground. Aside from the compelling performance of the terrified man, the creative editing and the wonderful practical effects, what makes this scene so brilliant is the tension that is imbued. H.P. Lovecraft famously said that the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. Tension is not all about fear, but the principle of how to create good tension is the same. It is the prospect of the unknown. That outcomes and consequences will happen, but we don't know how or when is the essence of good tension. By obscuring elements of the future from our audience, but making it clear that this situation has a very real prospect of ending badly, we establish immediate stakes that contribute to the tension our readers will feel. Returning to An American Werewolf in London to illustrate this, for almost 3 minutes we do not see the werewolf. We hear sounds, we watch the man's fear grow, we know that there is a danger here. He knows it too. We're not entirely sure what form it will take, but it is absolutely certain that something bad has a very real chance of happening. The setting, a man alone at night hearing animalistic noises in what should be an animal-free zone, means that we have every reason to expect something negative. As the scene develops, we only see the man's reaction, as the fear builds and the tension takes a darker, more sinister turn. The camera starts to follow from the perspective of the pursuer. We see panic take hold. We know we're getting closer to the point of failure, yet we never see the adversary until the end. Nor are we told explicitly what the consequences are about to be for the man. Such is the power of tension, that the unknown feeds our fear and hooks us to the scene. In a previous video, I have discussed the opening of Inglourious Basterds and referred to its use of tension there. Lessons from the Screenplay did a great video on the suspense in that scene that I'll link below, and is well worth checking out, but what I love so much about this scene is the transition from tension to suspense. How we go from a sense of unease and anticipation to one of dread and fear. For today's video, however, let's focus on the tension in this scene. What the scene does so well is showing the characters, their expressions and outfits, and building an implication of what threat there is. It's not specific enough to be suspenseful, but we, as the audience, have a clear feeling of anticipation that something will go wrong. The point of tension when you're writing a book is to hook your reader, to make the story less predictable so that they will become invested in discovering the consequences of a setting or a character's actions. There's a reason we fall silent when a tense scene sucks us in, or why we jump when somebody speaks to us while we're reading a tense passage. Tension makes us invest. It makes us want to wrench our eyes away because of the fear, but our curiosity compels us to be glued to the page. So, how do we do it? The key with tension is to build it effectively. That starts by establishing stakes and goals for our characters. This gives us a good point of reference that we can contrast with the reality of the situation and its changing path. Once we've got that, we need some form of conflict to be introduced. This can be explicit, but generally implicit threats work better, as they leave some of the fear to the audience's imagination. We don't see the werewolf, but its noises imply hostility. Hans Lander is wearing a Gestapo uniform, even though he's seemingly charming and friendly. Implied conflict allows us to tense as we expect the point of friction to occur at any point. This is where we need to introduce some pace. All good tension starts slowly. We want to drip feed our audience enough information that they can anticipate something going wrong, but not so much that they are able to accurately predict what will happen. They may still be scared, but "see, I knew it" isn't as satisfying as a fear-filled silence. As Hitchcock's famous clock ticks away, the more tension builds. So start slowly, keep things subtle and full of doubt. Slow pace builds anxiety that will create tension in return. We can't keep this pace for too long, however, or our audience will start to relax. If they relax, we may be able to surprise them at the point of revelation, but we don't want that. We want tension and chaos, not shock. So we have to gently increase the pace of our scene or story. Make sure we are moving ever more quickly so that the pace we end up at is just as terrifying as the slow plod, as because it makes the negative ending feel inevitable. We're now moving so fast that we can't stop. But we can. We can slow back down if we want to. Altering the pace can make your story even more unpredictable, but we do have to be careful that we're not bluffing or misleading our audience. This can, again, turn off our reader as they lose trust in us and feel manipulated. So while we can change the pace, like the brief pause before the revelation in Werewolf, it allows for that extra moment and drop of dread. The other point that is important for tension before the revelation is the characters who the tension is happening to. In The Descent, it is established that the 6 women are all expert adventurers. That is set up in detail beforehand. They have the lingo, the equipment, the casual attitude to caving that comes with experience, and overcome several problems early on that demonstrate their skill. That's why when things start to go wrong, we feel extra tension. If these experts are struggling, then the situation is far from ideal, and we have another reason to be afraid. Similarly, the French farmer is a sympathetic character who we don't want to see bad things happen to. He is vulnerable compared to his adversary, and that makes us worry all the more. In Werewolf, the man is an everyday worker who we know is wholly unprepared for what he is facing. They are relatable to many of us who commute by tube, and that makes us feel that extra ounce of tension as things unfold. So once we've got all the ingredients in place and the tension has been built, we have to reveal our cause of tension. That may be showing the monster, having failure come into fruition, releasing the tension with a moment of ecstatic escape or the emotional punch at the point of risk. Or we can move into suspense. The revelation has to be timed correctly. Too early and it feels rushed, too late and it feels manipulative. Our audience can hold the tension for time, but once it breaks, it's hard to build that back up within the same story, so you need to make sure you release that tension at the moment of optimal emotional impact. Where that is will depend on you and what emotion you want from your reader, but all that effort needs to be rewarded with a lot of payoff. The more tension you build, the higher the anticipation, and therefore the more important it is to time everything right. I should say a final point, which is that tension isn't exclusive to horror or thrillers like the examples I've been using today. Tension is any sense of anticipation. It can be romantic tension, time tension, achievement tension, recovery tension, and so on. Anytime there is a goal that needs or wants to be achieved, and a chance that it can fail, we have an opportunity to increase tension. In any sporting challenge, somebody has to lose. In every romantic interaction, there is a chance for rejection or conflict. In any medical emergency, there is a chance of failure. There is a tension everywhere, and in most interactions that involve character goals. Just remember that you don't need to explain and show everything. Instead, use the unknown and the anxiety and fear that it creates to make your story even more gripping. Something that you'll notice in some of the best films and books is that the beginning tends to have a strong opening. There is always something that sucks you into the story and makes you curious about everything that could be about to unfold. This is called a narrative hook. Think about the Tantive 4 outrunning the Death Star, or the immortal opening words of Pride and Prejudice. Katniss wakes at the start of the story amidst the reaping. Colonel Aurelio Buendia's story starts with him facing a firing squad. Pirates of the Caribbean has Elizabeth on her crossing from England, and almost every Agatha Christie book starts with somebody getting murdered. These opening moments are so important to get right, so that we can suck our reader into the world and make them want to invest their time with our story. So let's go over a few things that you need to remember when doing this well. Importantly, however, let's keep in mind that these are narrative hooks, so they must in some way be connected to the narrative you're trying to tell, not just a random thing that happens at the start. This is important to keep your reader interested and invested in the correct thing. Starting in the middle of the action is a great technique that can instantly throw your audience into the story with the characters already in place and in their roles. This is fantastic for more fantastical stories, like Star Wars, where we have a lot to establish about our world and lots of moving pieces straight out of the gates. Starting in the middle of an unfolding situation has lots of benefits. Our reader will automatically be asking questions about how this situation came to be and where it's going. This is immediately more engaging and gets the story up and running. You can very quickly establish key characters, locations, stakes, and goals. Similarly, you can have a miniature story play out that sets up your characters and a wider narrative. This is what the first Indiana Jones film did, by showing us a full adventure of Indy. This is great for giving us a more detail-focused overview of our story, setting a tone and theme more permanently, and creating a more established setting and character. When we see Indy doing this from the start to finish, we learn more about his past, as this clearly isn't his first rodeo, nor the last time he'll find himself in a sticky situation. It helps the reader engage with meaningful action that sets things up nicely for things to come, especially if the opening part of your story is quieter, as it is in the first Indiana Jones film. Another thing that is very effective and utilized a lot in older books, but is nonetheless useful, is challenging your reader's perception of something. Giving them a provocative question or statement to chew on that could invoke a strong emotion or response. Pride and Prejudice opens with, "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of good fortune must be in want of a wife." We've talked about opening sentences before, and this is a great way to use them to hook your reader in and give them some brief understanding of what the story is about. Just as starting in the middle of the action can be useful, starting before or after the action is a great choice too. We see Andy Dufresne before he allegedly commits his crime. We don't see the crime itself, and this builds mystery and intrigue. We meet Colonel Buendia after he has committed his crime and been tried. This also makes our reader curious about what exactly has led to this situation. Both of these strategies are great for sucking our readers in and making them eager to fill in the gaps. Just remember that you do need an answer to that question at some point. Conflict is another essential overarching aspect of creating a good narrative hook. This doesn't have to be swords and fists, but having some sort of provocation is important for establishing stakes and crucial players within your story. Elizabeth struggles with the societal and internal conflict that characterized Pride and Prejudice, but this is expressed early in the story. The Lord of the Rings opens with the stakes and overarching universal conflict being set out clearly for the reader, and the conflict in Harry's story and fame contrasted with his horrible life with the Dursleys sets up clear motivations and character traits that carry throughout the story. Finally, from a more writing point of view, you need to make sure the imagery that you conjure is striking and strong. You want to do something radical and different. Introduce vivid and colourful descriptions that strike your reader. The first impression and hook will usually leave a lasting impression on your reader and make them want to find out where we're going. Similarly, showing more than telling is important when writing the hook, as you want to balance intriguing information with keeping lots of cards up your sleeve. It's a tricky act to pull off, but showing will help you get there and pull your reader into the story. So the next time you're thinking about how to open your story, or you're revising what you've written already, just remember that a narrative hook is very important if you want your audience to hang around right until the end.